Hi, I'm Dustin Abbott, and I'm here today to give you my final verdict on the new Canon 85mm f1.4L IS USM lens. Now, if you've been following this series, you're aware that I've got a whole playlist of comparisons to some of what I consider the most recent and top competitors to the lens. And that, of course, includes Sigma's 85mm f1.4 Art series lens, and you can see that comparison video here. I also compared it to the class leader, which is the Zeiss Otis 85mm f1.4, which is the only apochromatic lens in the class and delivers exceptional results. And you can see the comparison series there. I also compared it to the only other stabilized 85mm option in the class, and that's Tamron's 85mm f1.8 VC. And you can see my findings in both of these videos here. And so today I'm going to focus less on comparisons and more on just giving you the final verdict on the lens itself. And while I'll reference those other lenses, this is not so much a comparison as it is just an evaluation of the quality of this lens on its own merit. So, of course, this lens addresses a pretty important issue, or a couple of issues really, with the previous 85mm f1.2L Mark II, a lens that remains very popular as a portrait lens because of that bright maximum aperture. And while the autofocus is very slow, it's accurate, and the overall rendering from the lens is something that really works well for a lot of portrait photographers. And so it did have a few glaring flaws. So let's start by looking at some of the image quality, or excuse me, the build quality type issues. And if you want to see a more detailed breakdown of the build quality, check out this video here. One of the major things that was lacking in the 85mm f1.2 lens was that it was not weather sealed. And so that creates a bit of an issue if you tend to do outdoor type photography or portrait work, or you're shooting events, even weddings, where sometimes the weather can turn sour on you. And so you'd have concerns about your very expensive lens potentially being damaged by the elements. The 85 f1.4L lens, it kind of follows the trend of Canon's 35mm f1.4L Mark II, in that it has a more robust build and a fairly high degree of weather sealing as a part of it. And that starts, of course, with the gasket at the lens mount, and it carries throughout the lens at important seals, and then terminates on both the front and the rear elements are coated with an expensive fluorine coating that not only is somewhat weather repellent, but also makes both of those easier to clean. So both of those things very, very welcome. As far as the build itself, it has a different lens profile than the 1.2 lens, and it's a little bit physically larger in some dimensions, but it's also a little bit lighter, probably due to having smaller elements due to one maximum aperture of f1.4 versus 1.2. And so as a result, really when it comes to the weight and the size, this lens, although it's physically fairly large, it's kind of moderate in the class these days when you consider lenses like the Sigma 85 f1.4 Art lens that is considerably larger and considerably heavier. And so, and why the Sigma is so heavy, I'm not exactly certain, but it certainly is a very large and it's a very heavy lens. And so I think that the Canon has got a win there in the combination of the build quality, the weather sealing, and then the actual physical size and weight of the lens, that not small, but you know, it's moderate. And really the only true competitor that is smaller and lighter is the Tamron, but it also has a smaller maximum aperture of f1.8. And so a win there. Now, in another episode, we took a look at the autofocus. And if you want to take a look at that, you can see that here. But the autofocus in this lens addressed another need, in that the 85 f1.2, it had a focus by wire system that frankly is not a favorite of a lot of photographers. For one thing, the focus was quite slow, and so as a result it was a challenging lens if you needed to focus quickly in certain situations. So that was an issue. Also, if you needed to manual focus, that focus by wire means that any input on the manual focus ring has to be routed through the camera body. The camera body then actually moves the elements through the focus motor. And so it's not my favorite system. It's not a lot of your favorite system. And so this lens certainly addresses that with a more typical USM where there's a direct coupling to the lens elements here. So in other words, when I move this, the lens elements are moving. By the way, it also helps in that the actual focus is not in the rear element or the front element. It's all in middle elements. So as a result, both on the back end and on the front end, nothing moves in and out during focus. And so that's nice and further helping that weather sealing there. And so as a result, autofocus is faster than any of the 85mm competitors I looked at. The Tamron is close, but I give a slight edge to this lens. And beyond that, it's a little bit more confident on focusing on outer points. However, even if you have a very good camera, I'm shooting with a 5D Mark IV, and I've heard the same feedback from others that have a 1DX Mark II, that with any of these wide aperture lenses, you have to be somewhat selective at what focus points you use. And some of the, the non-cross type focus points just don't deliver as confident of autofocus with wide aperture lenses. And so again, it's about familiarity. I would advise you to just take a lot of photos, that aren't important before you shoot an important gig, and just get a sense of what's going to give you your best kind of results. And some will even go to the extent of actually turning those points off, which you have the option of doing so with this lens, and so that you can be left with the focus points, even outer focus points you can be more confident with. That being said, in a direct, kind of comparison, I found that I definitely got more focus accuracy than I did with, say, the Sigma, which focuses fine in the center group, but if you move to outer points, it's not as consistent. And again, anecdotal evidence from those of you that have owned and used the lens, a lot of you said that, in a lot of situations, you would actually take multiple shots to make sure that one of them was accurately focused, whereas you're not going to have to do that to the same degree with this lens here. And so autofocus there is certainly a win in terms of it's fast, it's quiet, and it's accurate. And so a plus there. Now, beyond that also, just in case you're considering throwing it on a Sony body, which I did some, it also actually focuses very well there via adapter, and also it focuses well in Canon's DP-AF, which means that it focuses well for video servo AF. Not every USM lens is created equally when it comes to that, and so I was happy to see a nice performance from the lens when it came to that kind of focus, since that's kind of a key component of just the general package of shooting these days. Now, when it comes to the image quality, it's a little bit of maybe a mixed bag there, in that in my various comparison series, the Canon is actually the least sharp of the four competitors that I looked at in head-to-head comparisons. And not by a big margin in some cases, but it's certainly, in the center, it's fairly close to all of them. It suffers a little bit from lower contrast in the center, and I'll circle back to that in a second. Outer points, it's not super sharp at the outer edges of the frame at wide apertures, and there's an article by a Canon engineer that actually says that's by intent, that in a lot of cases, for the most people that are going to use this, edge sharpness is as important. In fact, having some sharpness fall off may help even with the rendering itself. And so I found that kind of the key thing for me is that if, focusing on rule of thirds focus points, and with those focus points, I found that I still had, sufficient sharpness, and I was not unhappy with the results there. If you want to do a composition way out at the edge of the frame, however, at a wide aperture, that may impact you there. In most situations, it probably won't. And so anyway, just evaluation on that. And so it's not to say that this lens isn't sharp. It's very sharp, but it's not class leading. In fact, it's behind the class leaders. And all three of the other 85mm options that I compared it against they rank at the very top of the heap in terms of sharpness in the class. And so just note that I've been comparing it to very, very good competition. The real key issue here comes down to the fact that this lens has a fairly strong amount of longitudinal chromatic aberrations. No lateral CA, but the longitudinal chromatic aberrations, which show up as kind of a pink/purple fringing before the plane of focus and green fringing after the plane of focus. It's fairly pronounced, and it doesn't really clear up until around f2.8 and beyond. And so what happens with that is that it does rob the lens of some contrast, because it means that not all colors are equally focused. And so the byproduct of that is that you don't have as much contrast at wide apertures as you do with some of the competitors. The biggest issue with clearing up that CA is actually with the green fringing, and it's not something you can just click, the one button, remove chromatic aberration in Lightroom or Adobe Camera Raw. It means you have to use the eyedropper, and the eyedropper, it's a bit of a challenge because that green fringing and that green color is a more naturally occurring one. And so in a lot of scenes, you're going to have some green there that should be there. And so as a result, it's harder to sample that color and eliminate it, because by doing so, you would actually negatively impact the whole image. And so just note that that's a little bit of a challenge. And so how much of a factor this is really will depend on the shooting situation and your kind of tolerance for some of that green fringing. The other issue that I found is that the lens is fairly flare prone, and so if you're shooting in backlit situations, you just need to be smart in the way that you apply that and the way that you compose with the sun or flash unit, and so just kind of watch for that. And in some ways, it and in my comparisons, it and the Sigma are kind of the most challenged in that kind of situation. There are a few very serious strengths, however, for this lens in the optical performance. One of those is that it has the best light transmission of the bunch, and it delivers a brighter image at equivalent, aperture and shutter speeds compared to all the other lenses. And so what that means is this, combined with its great image stabilizer, is a low light monster. And if you shoot events or you shoot in settings where lighting is low, you're going to love this lens because it not only gives you great light transmission, and so it really sucks in the light, but on top of that, it gives you an effective image stabilizer, and that image stabilizer makes a big difference in a lot of settings. Okay, got the Canon here, and I'm trying to hand hold 85 millimeters here once again. We're going to turn on the image stabilizer now. There's an ever-increasing trend towards higher resolution camera bodies. What happens with those is that it shows off motion blur, which motion blur doesn't have to be something fast. It can be very subtle, and it can happen. And what I'm talking about in the subtlety happens at regular shooting speeds, 1/100th, even 1/200th of a second. All it takes is just a slight bit of movement, and on a lower resolution body, you wouldn't see that. It occupies so few pixels that you don't see it. But as you pack more pixels into there, it means that blur covers more pixels, thus becomes more evident. And the byproduct is there's a little bit of veiling that becomes apparent there that basically robs all of that additional resolution advantage that you would have had by having a higher resolution body. So bottom line is that if you're not shooting on a tripod, shooting a lens with an image stabilizer certainly makes a big difference. And I saw when I compared to the Otis that while the Otis is much sharper and has higher contrast in an absolute sense, when I compared them handheld, even at 1/200th of a second, that the Canon actually delivered a sharper, apparently sharper image because of that factor that I've just described there. And so that's certainly a major plus there. Low light performance, fantastic. Now, the other big advantage that I saw is that this lens actually delivers the best bokeh quality of the options I compared. The out-of-focus circles, if I'm shooting like highlights, are very smooth in the inner circle. They also have a very small, not highly defined inner line, which means that the actual real-world bokeh quality is softer. And I found that this lens was definitely the best of the bunch in the out-of-focus rendering. And thus, if you step back, instead of looking at a pixel level and you look at images globally, the images globally out of the lens are actually really, really fantastic. And so to wrap things up, I think that in some ways this lens has, it's not wowed me as much as what it could have due to my having very high expectations that were based on two things. One was the Canon 35mm f1.4L Mark II that had a new kind of blue re-refractive spectrum optics in it that basically eliminated the chromatic aberration that had been an issue with the previous generation lens, and it delivered a very Otis-like kind of result. You know, lots of contrast while still having very nice rendering. I bought the lens even though it was expensive, and I love it. Okay, and so that kind of affected my expectations of this lens to kind of eliminate that chromatic aberration issue, which obviously didn't happen. So why didn't Canon use the blue refractive optics in this lens? I don't know for certain. It may be that it doesn't work in this kind of focal length, and you know, it may also be the reason why this lens is less expensive than what we expected. I don't know exactly what happened there, but that kind of, you know, affected my expectations. And of course, the other thing that affected my expectations is that the third parties have put out such good competitive lenses in this class. And I think that all of us expected that Canon's first party L series lens would be kind of a knock it out of the park, better than all of the competitors. And it's not that. And I think that that is the reality of where we're at in terms of lens design, even camera design right now, is that there is, you know, we've reached a place of diminished returns right now. Everything is so good that it's hard for anything to be exceptionally better. And so I think that a choice around this decision needs to surround what your actual shooting needs are. So if you need an image stabilizer, and if you need a maximum aperture of f1.4, this is the only option that you have. And fortunately, it is a very, very good lens. And so I want to encourage those of you that have bought this lens or considering this lens, and you look at some of these comparisons, you say, well, it's not as sharp as this lens or that lens. You know, bottom line is that we're talking about little tiny nths of degrees here in separating these lenses. And the reality is that all of them are plenty sharp to get the job done. Bottom line is that if you can't get good images out of any of these lenses that I've looked at in this 85mm comparison, the problem is not really in the lens. They all deliver great results. You just need to use them all to their strengths. I'm Dustin Abbott, and if you'll look in the description down below, you can see my full written review, a link to that on my website. You can also see buying links for this lens and other lenses there. You can take a look at the image gallery of a lot of photos accumulated during this review cycle. And of course, if you haven't followed me on social media or become one of my patrons, you're welcome to do so there. And finally, if you haven't clicked that subscribe button, please do so. Thanks for watching. Have a great day.